Hi everyone, I'm Victor from Bitrise and this is the Bitrise changelog. Let's get into what's new. We improved how you can configure your local development environment to benefit from Bitrise build cache. This was already possible, but we made it easier and more straightforward to do. So what are the highlights for this change? Faster local builds essentially means that your local builds can now also benefit from the same remote build caching as your CI build so far using Bitrise build cache. The second point is zero project disruption. So by following the standard guide, you will configure Bitrise build cache for the specific machine and not for a project. This means that on the specific machine where you do the setup, Gradle and Bazel can connect to the remote build cache automatically without modifying any project configuration file. It's also possible to control whether you want to push into the remote build cache from your local development environment or pull only from the build cache. By default, the system will set it up so that you will only pull from the build cache, which is the recommended configuration. The reason for this is this is a standard recommendation in case of both Gradle and Bazel, that in a more dynamic environment, like your development environment, you should not push into a remote build cache, but you should only pull from it. In case of CI, the default configuration will both push and pull from the remote build cache. But when you are connecting from a development environment, you should only pull from the build cache. It's possible to change this, but the default setup follows the recommendation of the tools. Last but not least, if you follow the setup, you'll also benefit from analytics or insights, where you will be able to see information about every single Gradle or Bazel command that you are running. So let's quickly go through an actual setup, one for Gradle and one for Bazel, to see how this works. You can find the links to the updated Dev Center guides. Essentially, when you go to the Gradle build cache specific section, there's now a configure the Bitrise build cache for Gradle and local environment section, and similar for Bazel as well. So following the guide, what you need to do is we need two pieces of information which will have to be provided as parameters. One is for authentication purposes, a personal access token, and the other one is the workspace identifier. Both of these information have to be set as environment variables if we are following the steps. So let's gather this piece of information. For now, I just created a temporary file where I will collect both of these information. When we are working in a terminal, the way to set environment variables is to use export, then the key, equal sign, and then the value. So as you can see, we need these two environment variables. These will be the keys, and we'll get the values following the guides. So to get the personal access token, what we have to do is open your personal account settings and then go to security. And here we can create personal access tokens. Let's create one. I'll use a super short-lived one. For actual integration, you should use a longer one. As a best practice, we would suggest to use an expire token, but you can also choose never expire. For this example, I will use an expiration of 1 hour, which will be fine for the demo, and it will be invalidated very quickly. So let's copy the value of this. This is the value for Bitrise build cache authentication token. The second piece of information we need is the workspace ID. And you can get that from the workspace settings. Let's go there. And here under general settings, you can find the workspace slug or the workspace ID, which you can copy. And then we'll use that as the value. Let's open a terminal session and set these variables. The next step is downloading the Bitrise build cache CLI, which is an open source tool. You can review the code of it as well. This simple one-liner will download the Bitrise build cache CLI and save it under temporary bin. Now that we have the CLI available, we can run the activate command with it. Let's just copy paste the Gradle specific one. That's it. We now have Gradle configured to use Bitrise build cache on this machine. Before testing that it works, let's just quickly go through what it does. Other than downloading the necessary plugins for Gradle, it will create two files. It will create a Gradle init file, and it will create a Gradle properties file. If you open the init file, you can see that it generates a Gradle init configuration, which will essentially configure and enable build cache for remote using Bitrise build cache with the right endpoint and with the necessary authentication token. And it will also enable analytics. The other file, the build cache CLI modifies, is the Gradle properties file under the home.gradle directory. As the Gradle properties file is a shared file where you might have other configuration. Let's just add some examples. Example 1 here. It's important that we don't override any of your existing configurations in this file. So what the CLI does is it looks for this section and it will only modify any content between the two comments. Or if it isn't in the file yet, then it will append it to the very end of the file. As an example, I'll modify this to false. And what you will see if I rerun the Bitrise build cache CLI is that anything outside of these lines will not be modified, but what's in between the two will be overwritten. So when you change configurations, make sure that you aren't changing it between the two block markers, because those will be overwritten. I'll just rerun this, and as you see, anything between the two were overwritten, but everything outside are kept as it is. So how can we validate that this machine now actually can properly connect to Bitrise build cache? So at this point, we run the CLI and it created the necessary init file and the Gradle properties file where it specifically enables Gradle build caching. So all what's left to do is run any Gradle command just like you would. There's nothing special. You don't have to change anything. You just run Gradle commands as you usually do. This is a completely clean environment. That's why Gradle was also just downloaded and nothing else was configured before. If you see these lines, the Bitrise build cache and the Bitrise analytics lines, that means that Gradle loaded in the init configuration and the build cache and the analytics plugins were initialized and used by Gradle. Once the command finishes, the other thing that you should see is a line like this, check invocation at, and there you can find a link, which if you can see information about that specific run of that command. So in this case, this was a Gradle build command, which was running for 29 seconds. You can see additional information about the critical path, uploads, downloads, the environment, Gradle, and Gradle-related versions. If it's an Android project, you can see Android-related version information as well. And you can also compare this invocation to other invocations of the same command. Now let's go through the Bazel-related configuration. We need the exact same two information, so authentication token and the workspace ID. The personal access token can be generated under account settings, security, personal access token, while the workspace identifier can be found under workspace settings, general settings, and workspace slot. And to set them, we can use the exact same method we used for Gradle. So using export in a terminal, then the key of the variable equals sign, and then the value that we want to set. Let's set both of these environment variables. So first the Bitrise build cache auth token, and then the Bitrise build cache workspace ID. And just like with Gradle, we can use the same one-liner to download the Bitrise build cache CLI. And once the CLI is available locally, we can run the second command, which will use the CLI to activate build cache for Bazel. And similar to Gradle, all the CLI does is it collects information and writes a configuration file for Bazel. It writes into the .bazelrc file under the home directory. And just like with the Gradle properties file, it adds the generated configuration between a starter and an end marker command lines. So anything that you specify here, let's go with the same example 1, example 2. Anything outside this block, the Bitrise build cache CLI will not modify, and everything between these two lines will be overwritten. So if I add something here, and then run the CLI again, the changes we did between the two blocks were overwritten, but anything outside, even before or after, were not touched by the CLI. Now, to validate that the build cache configuration is working properly for Bazel, we can just run any Bazel command like we usually do. No changes needed. Let's do Bazel build in this project. If you see this line in the Bazel build logs, streaming build results to and the URL, that means that Bazel read the remote build cache related configurations and it actually connected to the remote build cache. You can see the same line and same URL at the very end of the Bazel build log as well. And when you open the URL, similar to the Gradle one, you can see information about this specific Bazel command invocation. You can see the Bazel version, the command and the pattern which was performed, information about targets, uploads, environments, and Bazel related information. And you can compare separate invocations with each other. So that's it. Now we have build cache configured for both Gradle and for Bazel. Happy building, and let us know if you have any questions or feedback. See you.